I create dark, extreme horror stories, and for just $1, you can help me keep the horror alive. It's like buying me a terrifying cup of coffee to fuel the next gruesome tale. If you'd like to support, please consider donating. My PayPal link is in the description. Due to YouTube guidelines, it's difficult to create R-rated content, so I kindly request you to join me on Patreon for just $1. Of the morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains, casting delicate patterns across the kitchen floor. Lydia sat at the table, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee, eyes fixed on the headlines of the local paper, another person missing. She glanced at her mother, Vanessa, who hummed while preparing breakfast, the soft clatter of pans filling the room. Vanessa was radiant these days, her newfound happiness evident in the way she moved around the kitchen. It had been 2 years since Lydia's father passed away unexpectedly, leaving a void that seemed impossible to fill. Then came Richard, tall, distinguished, and impeccably polite. Richard appeared as though he had stepped out of a family catalog. He was everything Vanessa needed, supportive, attentive, and most of all, he seemed to adore her. They had met by chance at a local charity event, and within months, they were married. Lydia tried to be happy for her mother, but something about Richard felt off. His charm was almost too calculated, his smile too perfect, like a well-rehearsed act. Lydia, at 27, had moved back home after her father's death to help support her mother through her grief. But since Richard's arrival, Lydia felt more like an intruder in her own home. The house, once filled with quiet memories of her father, was now marked by Richard's subtle dominance. The changes were small at first, different furniture, new routines, but they were all unmistakably his influence. Still, Lydia couldn't put her finger on what exactly bothered her about Richard. He was careful, methodical in how he handled everything. And yet, there was something unsettling in his too-perfect nature. The town had never been the same since the first disappearance, almost 6 months ago. A local woman, about Vanessa's age, had vanished without a trace. Lydia had heard the rumors, the whispered fears, but the police had no leads. Then another person disappeared. Immerses continued, each one more baffling than the last. As the town fell deeper into paranoia, Richard's presence in their home became more pronounced. He was always there, always watching, always smiling. The missing people never returned. Lydia began to notice the way Richard would subtly steer conversations away from the disappearances whenever they were mentioned. Vanessa seemed to notice nothing. Her world was Richard now. One evening, Lydia found herself alone in the kitchen with Richard. He sat across from her, casually sipping tea, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her stomach twist. "You've been distant lately," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "Is everything all right?" Lydia stiffened. I guess I'm still adjusting." Richard nodded, that perfect smile never wavering. "Change can be difficult. But you'll see, Lydia, this is good for your mother. And for you." She forced a smile, but something about his words felt like a warning. As the weeks passed, Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that Richard's perfection was a mask hiding something far darker. She began to dig into his past, searching through old news articles and records. She found almost nothing. No family history, no childhood photos. It was as if Richard had appeared out of thin air. The only trace of him was a brief mention in a local paper years ago. Connected to another woman, his first wife, she died in a house fire. The official cause was ruled an accident, but something about the timing felt wrong. The fire had started just weeks after their marriage. Lydia's stomach churned as she read the details. Another perfect family shattered. Lydia didn't tell her mother about her suspicions. Vanessa was so happy, and Lydia feared what the truth might do to her. But the more Lydia uncovered, the more the pieces didn't fit. Richard had changed his name twice, each time after a major tragedy, a lost family, a dead wife. Too convenient. The breaking point came when another person vanished from the town, a woman who had been at the charity event where Richard and Vanessa first met. Lydia knew it couldn't be a coincidence. One evening, when Vanessa was out, Lydia confronted Richard. She needed answers. The tension between them had been building, and she couldn't stand it any longer. "I know about your past," Lydia said, her voice shaking with both fear and anger. "I know about the accidents, the fires, and the disappearances. Who are you really?" Richard's smile faltered for the first time since she'd met him. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, as if savoring the moment. He walked around the table until he stood directly behind her. Leaning in close, "You think you know something, don't you?" His voice was cold, a chilling contrast to the warmth he usually radiated. "But you don't know anything. You don't understand what it takes to create the perfect family." Lydia's heart pounded in her chest as Richard moved closer, his breath hot against her ear. "Sometimes, to build something beautiful, you have to tear down what's broken. And your mother, she was broken when I found her. I'm fixing her." She could barely breathe, the weight of his words crushing her. She bolted from the kitchen, her mind racing. She had to get out. She had to warn her mother. But before she could reach the front door, Richard was there. Blocking her path, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "Lydia, you can't leave," he said, his voice eerily calm. "This family isn't finished yet." The next few days were a blur. Lydia found herself confined to the house, Richard watching her every move, his mask of charm now fully gone. He became a different man, meticulous, controlling, violent. Vanessa, oblivious to her daughter's pleas, continued to fall deeper under Richard's spell. She refused to believe Lydia's accusations, convinced that her daughter was just jealous. Real horror began. Late one night, Lydia awoke to the sound of heavy footsteps outside her door. She barely had time to react before Richard burst into the room, dragging her from her bed. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the suffocating silence of the house. He tied her to a chair in the basement, his eyes dark with a sadistic gleam. "This is for the good of the family," he whispered as he brandished a blade, running it lightly across her skin. "Sometimes, you have to bleed for the ones you love." What followed was a nightmare of pain and torment. Richard, methodical and unhurried, carved into her flesh, his obsession with control driving every stroke. Lydia's screams echoed in the basement. But they never reached her mother's ears. Vanessa was too far gone, lost in the illusion Richard had crafted. Days passed, each one more agonizing than the last. Richard took his time, savoring every moment of Lydia's suffering. He kept her alive, just barely, feeding her enough to prolong the torture. The basement became her prison, the air thick with the scent of blood and decay. It wasn't until Lydia was on the brink of death that she finally understood Richard's twisted game. He didn't just want to control the family, he wanted to perfect it. And in his eyes, she was the flaw, the one thing preventing the ideal life he had envisioned. But there was one thing Richard hadn't counted on, Lydia's will to survive. On the final night, as Richard prepared for what he promised would be the final cut, Lydia managed to free her hand from the ropes. She waited until his back was turned before grabbing a shard of glass from the floor and plunging it into his neck. Richard staggered, blood pouring from the wound, his eyes wide with shock. Lydia, fueled by a desperate rage, watched as he collapsed to the ground, his perfect facade finally shattered. As Richard lay dying, Lydia stumbled upstairs, her body broken but her spirit mother in the living room, oblivious to the carnage below. Vanessa looked up, her face a mixture of confusion and horror. "Lydia, what have you done?" But Lydia didn't answer. She simply collapsed into her mother's arms, the nightmare finally over, or so she thought. weeks later, as the town slowly recovered from the horrors that had unfolded, another body was found. A woman, her throat slit, her eyes wide with terror. And in her hand, a note, "Family is everything." Weeks passed since that fateful night in the basement. Lydia's body was healing, but her mind was in pieces, torn apart by the horror she'd endured. The house, once suffocating, was now a mausoleum. Richard was dead. The police had quietly closed the case, calling it a domestic disturbance gone wrong. Vanessa was a wreck, her grief compounded by confusion. The woman who had once sung joyfully in the kitchen now barely left her room, her world a shattered illusion. But despite Richard's absence, his presence lingered like a stain in the air. Lydia moved back into her own apartment in town, determined to reclaim her life. She got a job at a local gallery, surrounded by art and creativity. She found brief moments of escape in the delicate brushstrokes of paintings, the silent conversations between sculpture and space. But at night, when the world was quiet, she felt him, Richard. The way he'd look at her. The control he'd exerted over every moment. She could still hear his voice whispering in her ear, "Family is everything." Lydia's nightmares grew more frequent, but in the waking world, she buried them deep. She had to move forward. It was Vanessa who dragged her back into the darkness. One late afternoon, Lydia returned to her apartment to find her mother sitting in the living room, staring vacantly out the window. Vanessa hadn't visited in weeks. "Mom? What are you doing here?" Vanessa turned to her slowly, her eyes glassy and distant. "About us." Lydia's skin prickled. The last thing she wanted was to talk about him. "Mom, he's gone. It's over." "We don't need to." "No," Vanessa interrupted, her voice eerily calm. "It's not over. I think I made a mistake." Lydia froze. "What do you mean?" Vanessa's lips trembled, a bitter laugh escaping. "You don't understand. You never did. Richard wasn't what you thought he was. You've always hated him." "I never hated him," Lydia lied. Vanessa stood abruptly, her sudden movement startling Lydia. "You don't know what it's like to need someone, Lydia. After your father died, I needed him. He saved me." Lydia clenched her fists. "Mom, he tortured me. Stop." Vanessa screamed, her face contorted with rage. "You're lying. You're making it up. You always hated him, you couldn't stand that he was part of this family." Lydia stared at her mother, speechless. Vanessa had always been fragile, but this was something else. Something darker. "I didn't make a mistake," Vanessa said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You did." 2 days later, Marcus arrived, tall, dark, and devastatingly handsome. Marcus looked like a man out of a dream, or a nightmare. He was introduced as an old family friend of Richard's, someone who had been close to him in his previous life, before Vanessa. Marcus came to town to pay his respects after learning of Richard's tragic death. His arrival was timed perfectly, just when Vanessa needed someone to help her navigate her grief. He was just like Richard, charming, attentive, a perfect companion. But unlike Richard, Marcus exuded a raw, dangerous energy that Lydia couldn't ignore. He visited Vanessa often, spending long hours in the house, comforting her, helping her with repairs. But more than once, Lydia caught Marcus watching her, his gaze lingering just a bit too long. There was something unsettling in his smile, something to focus on her own life, but every time she thought of Marcus, her thoughts wandered back to Richard. The way he had manipulated her mother. The way he had tortured her. The way he had almost killed her. And now here was another man, stepping into the void Richard had left behind, and Vanessa was falling for it all over again. Lydia didn't trust him. She started digging into Marcus's past, just as she had with Richard. But there was nothing, no record, no history. Just like Richard, Marcus seemed to have appeared from nowhere. She brought her concerns to Vanessa, but her mother dismissed them. "You're being paranoid," Vanessa said, her voice soft but firm. "Marcus is nothing like Richard. He's been helping me, Lydia. He's been good to us." Lydia wanted to believe her, but the tension between her and Marcus only grew. Whenever they were alone, he'd make subtle comments, little remarks that set her on edge. "You remind me of someone," Marcus had said one evening, his eyes trailing over her body. "Someone I knew a long time ago." Lydia didn't respond, but her skin crawled, days turned into weeks, and Marcus's presence in the house became more suffocating. He started spending the night, his voice echoing through the walls in whispered conversations with Vanessa. Lydia stayed away as much as she could, but every time she came home, she felt his eyes on her. Watching. Waiting. The tension between them boiled over one night when Lydia came home late. She walked into the kitchen to find Marcus standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. "You're out late," he said without turning around. Lydia ignored him, heading to the fridge. "What are you still doing here?" Marcus turned slowly, his smile sharp. "I'm here for your mother. She needs me." Lydia slammed the fridge door. "She doesn't need you. She needs help." Marcus stepped closer, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Oh, I think she needs me more than—" Lydia's heart raced as she backed away. "Stay away from me. Stay away from her." Marcus laughed softly. "You don't get it, do you? This is how it's meant to be." Richard knew it. "I know it." Lydia's pulse quickened. "What the hell are you talking about?" Marcus's smile widened. "You'll see." Before she could react, Marcus grabbed her, pinning her against the counter. His hands were strong, too strong. Lydia struggled, but he held her in place, his breath hot against her ear. "I could break you right now," he whispered, his voice low and menacing. "I could snap your neck, and no one would know. No one would care." Lydia's breath hitched, panic flooding her veins. But before she could scream, Marcus released her, stepping back with a cold smile. "Good night, Lydia," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Sweet dreams." Lydia didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. She knew now, Marcus was just like Richard. Maybe worse. The next few days were confusion and terror. Marcus's behavior became more erratic, more unpredictable. He started appearing in Lydia's dreams, his hands on her body, his voice in her ear, whispering promises of pain and pleasure. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding, her skin crawling. But the dreams didn't stop. They grew more vivid, more erotic, more terrifying. She found herself drawn to him in ways she couldn't explain. Despite her fear, there was something magnetic about Marcus, something she couldn't resist. He knew it too. He played on her fears, her desires, pushing her further into a web of psychological torment. One evening, when Vanessa was out, Marcus cornered Lydia in the hallway. His eyes were dark, his smile predatory. "I know what you want," he whispered, his hand brushing against her arm. "You can't deny it. I've seen the way you look at me." Lydia recoiled, but her body betrayed her. Her heart raced, her skin tingling with a mixture, but she couldn't stop thinking about him. Marcus leaned in closer, his lips brushing against her ear. "Let me show you what real power feels like." Lydia's breath hitched as his hand trailed down her body, his touch both cold and electrifying. She wanted to scream, to push him away, but something inside her held her still, frozen in a twisted mix of fear and arousal. "Don't fight it," Marcus whispered, his voice a seductive hiss. "You'll enjoy this." Lydia's mind screamed for her to run, to escape, but her body was paralyzed. Marcus's hands moved with terrifying precision, his touch both cruel and intoxicating. "You're just like your mother," he whispered, his breath hot against her neck. Weak. Desperate. "But I'll fix that." Lydia's pulse raced as Marcus's grip tightened, his hands sliding under her clothes. She bit back a scream, her mind spinning as the line between pleasure and pain blurred. Marcus's control over her was absolute, his power suffocating, but as his touch became more brutal, more violent, something inside Lydia snapped. With a sudden burst of strength, she shoved him away, her heart pounding in her chest. "Get away from me!" She screamed, her voice shaking with rage and terror. Marcus stumbled back, his smile fading for the first time. He looked at her with something resembling admiration. "I knew you had it in you," he said, his voice cold. "You're stronger than I thought." The confrontation with Marcus marked a turning point for Lydia. Though she had stood her ground, the underlying fear festered. She could no longer deny it, he was a dangerous man. Each day, his presence loomed over her like a shadow, a constant reminder of her vulnerability. She'd noticed the way he'd linger at the edges of the room, his gaze heavy with a mix of admiration and hunger, the predatory gleam never from him escalated. Marcus seemed to take pleasure in testing her limits, pushing her toward the brink of fear. He would visit when Vanessa was out, often leaving her feeling trapped in a twisted game of cat and mouse. And just when Lydia thought she'd finally escaped his grasp, he would pop up unexpectedly, weaving himself deeper into her life. One evening, Lydia returned home from work to find a surprise waiting for her. A bouquet of roses sat on the kitchen table. The flowers were beautiful, but a sense of dread crept in as she recognized the card attached. "For my beautiful lady, Marcus." She felt a shiver run down her spine as she plucked the card from the bouquet. The scent of the roses mixing with the growing stench of Marcus's encroachment on her life. "Mom." She called, but the house echoed with silence. She glanced around, feeling the walls close in, every creak of the house amplifying her anxiety. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the kitchen and wandered into the living room. That's when she noticed the photographs on the wall. Each picture was of her mother and Richard, but now Marcus had taken Richard's place in every frame, as if the past had been rewritten in real time. In every photo, he was smiling at the camera, his arm draped over Vanessa's shoulders, a sickening display of normalcy that twisted in Lydia's stomach. Lydia felt rage boil within her. This was too much. She grabbed her phone and dialed her mother's number, but the call went straight to voicemail. "Where are you?" Lydia muttered, pacing the room. The door creaked open behind her, and Lydia turned to find Marcus leaning casually against the frame, his expression lazy, yet predatory. "Nice flowers?" he asked, stepping inside uninvited, a sly smile playing on his lips. "Why are you doing this?" Lydia shot back, her heart racing. "You don't belong here." "Why not?" he said, moving closer, a low, smooth voice that said, "Just here to help your mother, to be the family she needs." "That's not what she needs," Lydia replied, her voice rising. "You're just filling a void. She doesn't see you for what you are." Marcus's smile faltered for a moment, but he recovered quickly, his gaze darkening. "And what is that exactly, Lydia? A kind man? A supportive friend? Or perhaps, the perfect stepfather?" The last word echoed ominously in Lydia's mind, twisting the knife deeper. She stepped back, trying to regain control over the situation. "You think you can just walk in here and play house?" Marcus laughed softly, a sound that made her skin crawl. "Oh, I'm already a part of the family, dear. You may not see it yet. But this is just the beginning." As the days passed, Marcus's grip tightened around both Lydia and Vanessa. Lydia began noticing odd things. a blood-stained shirt in the laundry, Vanessa's increasingly erratic behavior. She would catch her mother staring blankly at walls or talking to herself, the grief mixing with something darker, something that made Lydia question her mother's sanity. "Mom, are you okay?" Lydia would ask, concern lacing her voice. But Vanessa would merely smile, a vacant look in her eyes. "I'm fine, dear." "I have Marcus," she'd reply, her voice dripping with a hollow cheer. "He makes everything better." Each time she heard her mother say Marcus's name, it felt like a stab to her heart. There was a sinister edge to their relationship, a sense of desperation that she couldn't shake. One evening, in a fit of frustration, Lydia dug deeper into Marcus's past. Her gut told her that the charming exterior was nothing but a mask for something more sinister. She spent hours searching online, flipping through articles about missing persons and local crime reports. The more she dug, the more pieces fell into a glimmer of hope. She stumbled upon a photo that made her blood run cold, a newspaper article featuring Marcus from years ago. The headline read, "Charming salesman linked to series of disappearances." Lydia's heart raced. The article detailed a string of cases involving women who had disappeared after befriending a man who fit Marcus's description. He'd left a trail of broken lives, and the authorities had lost track of him. She raced back to her apartment, determination coursing through her veins. She had to confront her mother, to reveal the truth about the monster lurking in their home, but when she arrived, the house was dark. The silence was deafening. Panic gripped her. "Mom," she called, her voice trembling as she searched the house for any sign of life. A flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow moving through the hallway. Lydia's heart pounded as she followed the sound, her breath hitching in her throat. As she entered the living room, she found Vanessa standing in front of the large mirror, staring at her reflection. "Mom?" Lydia asked softly, taking a cautious step forward. "What are you doing?" Vanessa didn't respond, her eyes locked onto the mirror, a strange smile creeping across her lips. "Mom, please," Lydia pressed, worry flooding her voice. "This isn't you." But Vanessa remained frozen, lost in a trance, until finally. She turned slowly to Lydia, her expression disturbing and vacant. "He told me you're the problem," she said, her voice low and eerie. "He said you're trying to tear us apart." Lydia's breath caught in her throat. "Who told you that?" "Mom, it's Marcus. He's dangerous. Stop lying." Vanessa shouted, snapping out of her stupor for a moment. "You're just like your father. Always trying to The little bird is flapping her wings again. How delightful." Lydia's heart sank as she realized she was trapped between her mother and this man who had woven himself into their lives. "You're manipulating her," she yelled, her voice filled with desperation. "Manipulating?" Marcus feigned surprise, tilting his head. "I'm simply showing her what real family looks like. You wouldn't understand, Lydia. You've always been a thorn in our side." The air crackled with tension as Marcus advanced toward Lydia. "Why can't you just accept that I'm here for her? That I love her?" Lydia's mind raced. "You don't love her, you want control. You're just like Richard." Marcus's expression darkened. And for a brief moment, the charming facade slipped. "You don't know anything about love, Lydia. You think this is just about family. It's about power, about dominance. You'll never understand the sacrifices we make for love." "Sacrifices?" Lydia shot back, her voice rising. "You mean the lives you've destroyed?" The air shifted as Vanessa stepped toward Marcus, her eyes filled with a mix of admiration and fear. "You don't understand, Lydia. Marcus is everything I need. He's stronger, he knows what to do, he can protect us. With a chilling calm, Marcus placed a hand on Vanessa's shoulder. "We don't need you, Lydia. You're just a reminder of a life that's better off dead." Lydia's heart raced as the realization hit her. Marcus had his claws deep in Vanessa, twisting her mind, turning her against her own daughter. This was a war, and she was losing. "Mom, you have to fight this," Lydia pleaded, stepping closer to her mother, desperation in her voice. "He's not who he pretends to be. You have to see that." But Vanessa's eyes were glassy, her mind consumed by Marcus's influence. "No, Lydia. You're wrong. You're the one who doesn't belong here." The atmosphere grew thicker as Marcus's grip tightened around Lydia's throat, a twisted game of dominance unfolded. "You were never meant to be part of this family," he said, his voice a silken whisper. "You were an obstacle, a mere afterthought. But now you're just a problem." With a swift motion, he flung Lydia to the ground, pinning her beneath him. Panic surged through her, but beneath it lay a simmering rage. She had to fight back. "Get off me!" Lydia yelled, struggling against his weight. Marcus leaned closer, his breath hot against her skin. "Do you know what happens to problems, Lydia?" Lydia struggled beneath Marcus, her heart racing as fear coursed through her veins. The knife glinted in the dim light, casting wicked reflections that danced across her vision. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to escape, but she was paralyzed by terror. "Do you feel that, Lydia?" Marcus whispered, leaning in closer, his voice a serpentine hiss. "That's the weight of your impending doom. You've meddled too much in matters you don't understand." With a quick motion, he pressed the blade against her neck, the cold steel biting into her skin. "But don't worry. I won't kill you. Not yet. I want you to watch." "Watch what?" Lydia gasped, her mind racing as she fought to maintain some semblance of control. "Watch your mother become who she was always meant to be," he said, his eyes glimmering with sadistic glee. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, and Marcus's grip on her tightened. "Speak of the devil," he said, a dark smile spreading across his face. "Your mother is home. Let's see if she's ready for the final act." Vanessa stepped through the door, her demeanor eerily calm. "What's going on in here?" she asked, her voice dripping with concern that felt rehearsed, as if she was playing a role in a sick play. "Just a little family discussion," Marcus replied, releasing Lydia slightly but keeping his body hovering over her, ready to pounce at him, about to share some of her concerns about our little arrangement. "Mom, please!" Lydia cried, desperation pouring from her voice. "He's manipulating you. You have to see it." Vanessa's gaze flickered between them, a hint of uncertainty crossing her face. "Lydia, I trust Marcus. He's been so good to me." "That's because he's using you," Lydia shouted, a spark of defiance igniting her fear. "You're losing yourself, Mom." For a fleeting moment, Lydia saw a flicker of the woman she once knew in Vanessa's eyes, but it quickly vanished behind the veneer of Marcus's control. "Stop!" Marcus snapped, his patience thinning. "You're ruining everything, Lydia. If you can't play nice, maybe it's time to teach you a lesson." As he shifted his weight, Lydia seized the moment. She pushed with all her might, sending Marcus tumbling backward. It was a small victory, but it reignited her will to fight. "Get away from me!" Lydia screamed, scrambling to her feet. Vanessa blinked, confusion clouding her expression as she watched the scene unfold. "Lydia, please don't," but Lydia was already charging toward her mother, desperation fueling her actions. "Mom, listen to me. He's dangerous. You don't know who he really is." The two women stood inches apart, a palpable tension thickening the air. Marcus's rage bubbled beneath the surface, and Lydia knew she had to act quickly before he regained control. "Mom, we need to leave. We can't stay here." Suddenly, Marcus lunged for Lydia, but she dodged out of the way, her heart racing as she grabbed a nearby lamp and swung it at him. The lamp shattered against his shoulder, momentarily stunning him. "Run, Mom!" Lydia shouted, and they bolted toward the front door. But before they could reach it, Marcus blocked their path, his expression a mixture of anger and amusement. "Did you really think you could escape?" he taunted, a sadistic grin stretching across his face. "You're both trapped in my web." Vanessa stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Marcus, please. Just let us go. We can talk about this." But Marcus's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. "You don't get to negotiate, Vanessa. This isn't a discussion. It's a declaration." Without warning, he lunged at Lydia, his knife glinting in the light. Lydia ducked just in time, the blade slicing through the air above her head. "Get away from her." Vanessa screamed, and for the first time, there was a fire in her eyes, a hint of the woman Lydia had known before Marcus's influence had twisted her mind. "Mom, help me!" Lydia shouted, her fear reaching a fever pitch, but as Marcus turned his attention back to Vanessa, he grabbed her arm, the knife glinting dangerously close to her throat. "You need to understand who holds the power here," he growled, his grip tightening. Lydia's heart sank as she watched her mother's expression shift from fear to something darker, something that resembled acceptance. "Marcus, please. Just let her go," Vanessa pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can't protect her, Vanessa," he replied, his voice low and menacing. "You know that. You've always wanted a strong man to take control, to take the lead. Stop it. You're lying to her." Lydia yelled, desperation clawing at her throat, but as the tension escalated, Vanessa's demeanor changed again. "Lydia. You don't understand. Marcus is what I need. You're the one who's always been in the way." Lydia's heart shattered. "Mom, don't say that. I'm trying to help you." "Help? Or control?" Marcus interjected, a triumphant smirk on his face. "You've always resented her for wanting happiness. Look where it's gotten you." Lydia felt the ground shift beneath her as Marcus's words pierced through the haze of fear. "You're wrong," she spat, shaking her head. "I just want you both to see the truth." But it was as if Marcus had already won. Vanessa's eyes glazed, utterly helpless. "This isn't over," she declared, her voice shaky but determined. In a sudden burst of anger, she hurled the remains of the broken lamp at Marcus. The glass shattered against the wall, and for a brief moment, he turned away, caught off guard. "Run!" Lydia shouted to her mother, grabbing Vanessa's arm and pulling her toward the back door. They burst into the backyard, the cool night air hitting them like a wave of relief. "Lydia, wait!" Vanessa shouted, but Lydia didn't stop. She had to get them out of there. As they reached the back fence, Lydia turned to look back at the house, panic gripping her. "We have to climb over." But before they could make a move, Marcus emerged from the darkness, his silhouette framed by the light from the house. "Where do you think you're going?" "Stay back," Lydia shouted, her voice breaking. "Don't come any closer." Marcus's laugh echoed through the night, a chilling sound that made Lydia's skin crawl. "You think you can escape? This is just a game to me, Lydia. I've been playing it my whole life. Mom, please. You have to help me." Lydia turned to her mother, desperation etched on her face. "You can't let him do this to us." Vanessa's expression was a mix of confusion and indecision, but Marcus stepped closer, a twisted smile on his face. You don't need her, Lydia. You're just like your father, weak and broken. Stop. Just stop. Vanessa shouted, a flicker of defiance igniting in her eyes. I won't let you hurt her. In that moment, the dynamic shifted. Lydia felt a rush of hope as she realized her mother still had some fight left in her. Mom, we can get away. We just have to stick together. But Marcus wasn't finished yet. He lunged forward, his knife flashing in the moonlight. Enough games. In a desperate attempt to protect her mother, Lydia pushed Vanessa aside, taking the brunt of Marcus's attack. The knife grazed her arm, and pain surged through her body. Lydia! Vanessa cried, her voice filled with horror, but Lydia didn't back down. You won't take her from me. She screamed, charging at Marcus with every ounce of strength she had left. The two grappled, and in the chaos, Lydia managed to wrestle the knife from Marcus's grip. You're going to regret this, he hissed, his eyes wild with fury. With a primal scream, Lydia plunged the knife into his side. A look of shock washed over Marcus's face as he stumbled back, blood pouring from the wound. You think you've won? He gasped, his expression shifting from shock to rage. You don't know who you're dealing with. But Lydia stood her ground, breathing heavily, her heart racing. As she and Vanessa sprinted away from the house, Marcus's twisted laughter echoing behind them. The weight of the knife still clutched in Lydia's hand reminded her of how close she had come to losing everything. The cool night air stung the open wound on her arm, but she pushed the pain aside. She had to get her mother to safety. They reached the edge of the backyard, where the high wooden fence loomed before them, a final barrier to their escape. Lydia scanned for any weaknesses, any foothold they could use to climb over. Mom, we need to move. She urged, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Vanessa, still dazed and trembling, nodded weakly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. I can't believe this is happening. It's real, Mom. He's dangerous, Lydia said, fighting to keep her voice steady. But we can get out. We can leave him behind. Just as Lydia spotted a break in the fence where the boards had warped over time, a low creak came from behind them. They both froze. Marcus emerged from the shadows, blood staining his shirt from where Lydia had stabbed him, but his face was twisted into a sickening smile. He moved with a deliberate calm, as if the pain were merely an inconvenience. You think you're going to run from me, Lydia? From us? His voice was soft, dangerous, each word dripping with malice. There's nowhere to go. You belong here. Vanessa clutched Lydia's arm, her nails digging into her skin. Please, Marcus. Just let her go. We can talk about this. Talk. Marcus scoffed, his eyes narrowing. Vanessa, you've been talking too much. You've let her poison your mind, make you doubt what we have. He took another step forward, his presence casting an oppressive weight over them. But don't worry. I'll fix everything. I always do. Lydia's mind raced. She couldn't let him close the distance. Mom, go. She whispered harshly, pushing her face a mask of confusion and fear. Lydia, what are you doing? I'll distract him. Just go. Lydia shouted, steeling herself. She turned to face Marcus, holding the knife out in front of her. You're not going to hurt her. Marcus tilted his head, his smile never fading. Oh, Lydia. You really don't understand, do you? This isn't about hurting anyone. This is about love. About keeping our family together. Lydia's hands shook as she gripped the knife tighter. You don't love us. You control us. Marcus's smile faltered for the briefest moment, and something darker flickered in his eyes. You've always been the problem, Lydia. Always meddling, always questioning. But I've been patient. I've given you time to see things my way. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. Now that time is up. Lydia's heart pounded in her ears as Marcus lunged toward her, his hand outstretched like a predator ready to strike. She barely dodged, her body moving on instinct. The knife slashed through the air, grazing Marcus's side once more, but it wasn't enough to stop him. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it painfully until the knife fell from her grasp. Lydia cried out as he slammed her back against the fence, pinning her with his body weight. Enough. Marcus growled, his face inches from hers. His breath was hot against her skin, and his eyes bore into hers with a terrifying intensity. You fought long enough, Lydia. It's time to accept the truth. Lydia gasped, struggling to free herself from his grip. You're insane. Marcus chuckled, his lips brushing her ear as he whispered, not insane. Just in control. Before she could react, Marcus pulled a length of rope from his back pocket and swiftly bound her wrists together, securing her to one of the fence posts. Lydia's panic surged as she realized how thoroughly he had planned this. He was always... Lydia screamed, her voice breaking as she looked toward Vanessa, who stood frozen, her face pale. Run! But Vanessa didn't move. She stared at Marcus, her mouth opening and closing as if struggling to find the right words. Marcus. Please. Shoo, Marcus soothed, turning his attention back to Vanessa. It's okay, sweetheart. Everything is under control. He approached her slowly, like a hunter stalking its prey. We just need to calm her down. Lydia's confused. She's scared. But I can fix this. We can fix this. Vanessa's eyes darted between Lydia and Marcus, her hands trembling. I don't know. Lydia's stomach twisted. She could see the battle raging in her mother's mind, the struggle between loyalty to Marcus and the realization that something was terribly wrong. Mom, he's manipulating you. Lydia cried, her voice raw with desperation. You have to see it. Marcus reached Vanessa and gently took her hands in his voice soft and hypnotic. You don't need to worry, Vanessa. I'll take care of everything. Just like I always have. Vanessa's breathing quickened, her eyes welling with tears. I just want us to be happy. We are happy, Marcus whispered, his grip tightening on her hands. But Lydia's trying to destroy that. She's trying to tear us apart. No, no, no. Lydia screamed, her voice hoarse. Mom, he's the one tearing us apart. Please, listen to me. But Marcus's influence was like a vice, squeezing the life out of any remaining doubts in Vanessa's mind. Slowly, she nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Good girl, Marcus murmured, stroking Vanessa's hair. You're doing the right thing. Lydia's heart shattered as she watched her mother submit to Marcus's control. He had won, or so he thought. For a moment, the world seemed to slow down. Lydia's mind raced, trying to piece together a plan, an escape, anything that would break the stranglehold Marcus had on them. Marcus released Vanessa and turned back to Lydia, his eyes gleaming with a sinister satisfaction. Now, Lydia. Let's finish this. He approached her slowly, savoring every step, the rope in his hands trailing behind him like the promise of her doom, but Lydia wasn't going to wait for him to make the first move. With every ounce of strength she had left, she kicked out, her foot connecting with his knee. Marcus stumbled, caught off guard, and Lydia used the momentary distraction to wriggle free of her restraints. She lunged for the knife, her fingers closing around the hilt just as Marcus regained his balance. Enough. He roared, charging at her with a vicious snarl. But Lydia was ready. She twisted at the last second, slashing at him with the knife. The blade cut deep into his arm, and Marcus let out a howl of pain, clutching the wound, used against the wet earth as she ran through the thick woods surrounding their home. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and every muscle in her body screamed for her to stop, but she didn't dare. Marcus's haunting voice still echoed in her ears, his calm promise that she couldn't hide. Not from him, but she had to try. She had to find help. She had to get her mother away from him before it was too late. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above, casting long shadows that twisted and curled as if alive. The woods had always felt like a place of refuge for Lydia, a quiet place to escape her thoughts. But now, they felt like a living entity, something that conspired with Marcus to trap her. The further she ran, the more disoriented she became. The familiar paths blurred into one another, and soon she realized she was lost. Lydia stopped to catch her breath, her eyes scanning the trees for any sign of civilization. Behind her, there was a faint rustling sound, almost imperceptible against the wind. She froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained to listen. Nothing. She turned and continued running, but a deep-rooted fear told her that Marcus was still behind her. Watching. Waiting, Lydia's thoughts raced, replaying the events of the past few months. How had they missed it? The charming facade, the subtle control. Marcus had woven himself into their lives with such precision that it felt like an elaborate game to him, one where they were merely pawns in his web of lies. He had been so perfect in the beginning, too perfect. Always attentive to Vanessa, always calm, always composed. He had played the part of the doting husband with such conviction that even Lydia had begun to second-guess her own suspicions. His manipulation had been slow, creeping, like a cancer they couldn't detect until the little things, the way he'd insisted on knowing her mother's every move, the way he'd made casual suggestions about their routine that subtly shifted everything toward him. He always claimed he was trying to help, but now it was obvious. He had been tightening his grip, methodically cutting them off from everyone they knew. Her mother's old friends no longer visited, and even Lydia's attempts to leave for work had been met with resistance. He had isolated them, manipulated their emotions, and now, he was revealing his true face. As Lydia darted through the trees, she couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was enjoying this, that the hunt was as much about control as it was about punishment. He had been a master manipulator all along, hiding his monstrous nature behind a mask of kindness. Lydia stumbled into a small clearing, her breath heavy and labored. The dim moonlight illuminated an old, dilapidated cabin, hidden deep in the woods. It seemed abandoned, but she couldn't be sure. With no other options, she made her way toward it, praying that it would offer some form of safety. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty interior. She shut the door behind her and locked it, her body trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. Her mind raced. She needed to think, needed to figure out how to stop him. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic clang echoed from outside the cabin, sending a jolt of fear through her. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. She pressed herself against the door, straining to hear another clang. Then a dragging sound, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. It was him. It had to be. Lydia's hands shook as she clutched the knife tighter. She had no idea how he had found her so quickly, but she knew what he was capable of now. This wasn't a game anymore, Lydia. His voice floated through the air, soft and mocking, as though he was enjoying much harder than it needed to be. Lydia backed away from the door, her heart racing. She had to stay calm. She had to think. But the sound of Marcus's voice sent icy chills down her spine, freezing her in place. "I don't want to hurt you, Lydia," he called out, his voice laced with false concern. I've only ever wanted the best for us. For your mother. But you keep resisting. You keep fighting me." Lydia's throat tightened, her breath shallow as she listened to him circle the cabin. "I've been so patient with you. So understanding. But now I have to be the one to teach you a lesson." The door handle rattled, and Lydia's grip tightened on the knife as the door creaked open slightly. Marcus's shadow appeared in the doorway, tall and menacing, silhouetted by the moonlight. He stepped inside with slow, deliberate movements, his eyes gleaming with predatory intent. "Look at you," he said softly, as if observing a trapped animal. "So scared. So vulnerable." Lydia forced herself to breathe, every muscle in her body screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere left to go. "I didn't want it to come to this," Marcus continued, inching closer. "But you left me no choice." Without warning, Marcus lunged at her, his hands reaching for her throat. Lydia barely had time to react, slashing out with the knife. The blade connected with his arm, cutting deep into his flesh. Marcus howled in pain, but the sound quickly turned into a twisted laugh. "You think you can stop me?" He hissed through clenched teeth, his eyes wild with rage. "You think you can win?" Lydia stumbled backward, the knife slipping from her grasp as Marcus advanced on her, his expression darkening with murderous intent. He grabbed her by the throat, slamming her against the wall. Lydia gasped for air, her vision blurring as Marcus tightened his grip. "I told you," he whispered, his voice low and dangerous. "You can't hide." Everything became clear. Marcus wasn't just a manipulator, he was a monster. A sadistic killer who had been playing them all along, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal his true nature. As the darkness closed in around her, Lydia realized that Marcus had been right about one thing: there was no escape. But then, just as Lydia's world began to fade, the door to the cabin burst open, and Vanessa stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with terror. "Marcus. Stop!" She screamed, her voice shaking with fear. Marcus hesitated, his grip loosening just enough for Lydia to suck in a ragged breath. He turned to face Vanessa, his expression shifting from rage to something colder. "More calculating, Vanessa," he said softly, his voice dripping with false tenderness. "This isn't what it looks like." Vanessa's gaze flicked between Marcus and Lydia, her face pale as the realization of what was happening began to sink in. "Lydia was trying to hurt us," Marcus continued, his tone calm and reasonable, as though explaining a simple misunderstanding. "She doesn't understand what's best for the family. But I do." Vanessa's hands trembled as she stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "What? What have you done?" Marcus's eyes darkened, and for the first time, his mask of control slipped. "I've done what I had to do." Vanessa's gaze locked onto Lydia's. And in that moment, something shifted. The fog of manipulation that had clouded her mind began to lift, and the full horror of the situation hit her like a tidal wave. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't right." Marcus's expression twisted into something ugly, his eyes narrowing as he took a step toward her. "You're making a mistake, Vanessa. Don't let her confuse you." But Vanessa wasn't listening anymore. She reached for the knife Lydia had dropped, her hands shaking as she lifted it, pointing it at Marcus. "Stay away from her," she said, her voice trembling. His smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "You don't know what you're doing." "I know enough," Vanessa whispered, her grip tightening on the knife. For a long, tense moment, the three of them stood frozen, the air thick with the weight of the unspoken. Then, without warning, Marcus lunged at Vanessa, his hands outstretched. Vanessa screamed and thrust the knife forward, the blade sinking deep into Marcus's chest. He gasped, his eyes wide with shock as he staggered backward, clutching the wound, Lydia scrambled to her feet, watching in stunned silence as Marcus collapsed to the floor, his breathing shallow and ragged. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, Marcus's lips curled into a twisted smile, even as blood pooled around him. You think this is over? He whispered, his voice barely audible. You think you've won? Vanessa's hands shook as she stepped back, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Stay away from us. But Marcus's smile only widened as his eyes locked onto Lydia's. This is just the beginning. With those final, chilling words, Marcus's body went still, his eyes staring lifelessly at the ceiling. The room was hung heavy in the sky as Lydia and Vanessa stumbled through the dark woods, their legs aching and minds clouded with terror. Every step away from the cabin brought a new wave of relief, but also an undercurrent of fear. They knew Marcus was dead, or at least, they thought he was. But his final words haunted Lydia, crawling under her skin like a sickness. Vanessa clung to Lydia, her breath shaky, the knife still clutched in her trembling hand. The weight of what they had done sat between them like a wall. Marcus had controlled them for so long, and now, even in death, his shadow loomed over their every move. We have to call the police, Lydia whispered, though her voice trembled with doubt. The idea of explaining everything to the authorities made her stomach churn. Vanessa shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. No, we can't. No one will believe us. Lydia gripped her mother's arm, forcing her to stop. Mom, we don't have a choice. They'll find out eventually, and if we try to run, Vanessa closed her eyes, the weight of their predicament bearing down on her. She knew Lydia was right. The truth was inevitable. As they reached the edge of the woods and the warm glow of streetlights, Lydia fumbled for her phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed 911, her mind racing. She needed to stay calm, needed to make this sound like self-defense. But how could they explain the months of manipulation? The slow erosion of their willpower at Marcus's hands. Her mind flashed back to the moments where things started going wrong. The subtle digs Marcus had made about her being overly suspicious, the isolation from her friends, the careful way he'd made them depend on him. He'd been a master at playing the perfect husband, father figure, and protector. But beneath that mask was a violent monster, something they'd only fully realized tonight. The operator's voice crackled on the other end of the line. 911, what's the words out, her voice shaking. I think we've just killed someone. Please, we need help. The operator tried to ask more questions, but Lydia hung up, staring at the phone in her hands as her heart pounded in her chest. Would the police believe them? Or had Marcus woven a web so tight that it would be impossible to escape? They stood on the side of the road in silence, waiting. The minutes stretched out like hours until the faint sound of sirens grew closer. Lydia's body tensed, and Vanessa squeezed her hand, their mutual fear palpable in the cool night air. When the police arrived, the blue and red lights splashing across the trees, Lydia felt the weight of their situation pressed down even harder. The officers moved cautiously, their faces masked with suspicion as they approached the two women standing at the side of the road. Lydia tried to explain through tears what had happened, that Marcus had tried to kill them, that they had no choice but to defend themselves. Vanessa stood beside her, shaking but resolute, her hand still wrapped tightly around the bloody knife. They led them back to the cabin, their flashlights illuminating the path through the woods. When they arrived at the dilapidated structure, the reality of what they had done felt even heavier. Inside, Marcus lay in a pool of blood, his chest still and his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The officers exchanged looks. One of them kneeling to check his pulse, though it was clear he was long gone. As they began processing the scene, something nagged at Lydia's mind, something about the way Marcus had spoken before he died. His words, so calm and confident, as if he knew something they didn't. Lydia felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise as the officers moved through the cabin, inspecting the scene for any additional clues. "Anything else we should know?" one of the officers asked Lydia, his eyes narrowing. She shook her head, her mouth dry. "No, he just stayed silent, her eyes fixated on Marcus's body. But in the pit of her stomach, something felt wrong. Marcus had been a master manipulator, a predator who knew how to hide his darkness until the perfect moment. Why had it all unraveled tonight? Why had he suddenly revealed himself? It didn't feel like a mistake, as if on cue, one of the officers called out from a corner of the cabin. "Hey! We've got something over here." Lydia's heart skipped a beat as she watched the officer approach with something in his hand, a small, leather-bound journal, stained with dirt and age. "It was hidden behind the floorboards," the officer said, flipping through the pages. "Looks like he kept notes on everything." Lydia's blood ran cold as she realized what it was. Marcus's journal. His record of every move he'd made, every manipulation, every family he destroyed. It was a roadmap to his sick mind, a catalog of his control and violence. The officer glanced up, his expression hardening. "This is damning evidence. There's enough in here to arrest Marcus for multiple murders. He's been hiding under different names, going from family to family. Killing anyone who got in his way." Vanessa gasped, her face draining of color. "How many?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The officer shook his head. "We'll need to go through it more thoroughly, but it looks like he's done this at least 5 times before." Lydia's mind spun as the gravity of what they had uncovered hit her. Marcus hadn't just been a threat to them, he had been a serial killer, hiding in plain sight, carefully orchestrating the destruction of family after family. And they had been his latest victims. As the officers continued to process the scene, Lydia and Vanessa were led back to the squad car. They had been lucky, in a twisted way, lucky to have found Marcus's journal, lucky to have stopped him before he could continue his reign. The horror of what they had experienced would never leave them. Hours passed as they were questioned, their statements taken. The details of Marcus's manipulations, the slow erosion of their lives, were laid bare before the detectives. Every instance of psychological abuse, every mind game he had played to isolate and control them, was catalogued and dissected, the evidence mounted. Marcus's journal revealed the extent of his madness, a sick chronicle of his desire for the perfect family and the lengths he would go to achieve it. He had left a trail of broken lives, shattered families, and brutal murders across the country, changing identities and disappearing before anyone could connect the dots. As dawn broke, the police informed Lydia and Vanessa that they were free to go. They had acted in self-defense, and the evidence was clear. Marcus had been a monster, and they had barely escaped with their lives, but as they walked away from the station, their minds couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus had planned it this way all along, that even in death, he had won. His final words echoed in Lydia's mind, a chilling reminder that some evils never truly die. This is just the beginning. Weeks passed, and Lydia tried to move on with her life. She returned to her apartment, and Vanessa began to pick up the pieces of her shattered world. But the weight of Marcus's legacy hung over them like a dark cloud. One evening, as Lydia sat alone in her apartment, she received an unexpected call. It was one of the detectives who had worked on Marcus's case. "Lydia, there's something you should know," the detective said, his voice grim. "We've been going through Marcus's journal, and we've uncovered something else. Something that wasn't immediately obvious." Lydia's heart raced. "What is it?" The detective hesitated. "There's evidence to suggest that Marcus wasn't working alone." A chill ran down Lydia's spine. "What do you mean?" "It looks like he had an accomplice, someone who helped him target families, manipulate them, and disappear when things got too close. We're still trying to piece it together, but we believe this person is still out there. Lydia's blood ran cold as the realization hit her. Marcus's dark legacy wasn't over. The nightmare was far from finished. As she hung up the phone, Lydia felt a growing sense of dread. She glanced around her apartment, suddenly feeling as though she wasn't alone.